Hello, my 5th grade kiddos. I miss you guys. If y'all could see me right now, you would probably be laughing because I am sitting in a pitch black house with flashlights to do this lesson because once again, these little storms, my power has gone out. So it's pretty funny. This lesson, we're going to be talking about our first president, George Washington. And then fast forwarding a little bit towards the end, this will be our last bit of history where we talk about our nation at the very beginning and how America started. And then we're going to fast forward and end the school year with the Civil War. So we're having to kind of skip a lot. So Washington as president. Okay, so we've been talking about our new Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all this, and now that they have all that figured out, now they need a leader as president. Now remember, they've already decided there's 3 branches of government. They're going to be have equal power. The power also is going to belong to the people, but they still need someone to lead this executive branch. So of course, the common name, the only name, is George Washington for them to select. So, President Washington. Now, we learned a long time ago that he was a general in the army, then he helped lead throughout the American Revolution, but now when it comes to the presidency, he does not want it to be him. He thinks that he is too old and his health is not in the best of shape. He was 56 years old at this point, and he just thinks it needs to be somebody younger because he's scared his life may not last too much longer with his health. So Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton are kind of his right-hand men. They're his buddies, and they convince him that he is absolutely essential and needed for setting up this new government, that without him it will not work. So they convince him, you're who we need, you're indispensable, we have to have you as our leader of this executive branch with this new government, without you it won't work. So on February 4th, 1789, George Washington is elected by the Electoral College. Those are the people chosen by each state to vote for the president and vice president. And the number of voters is determined by however many senators plus House of Representatives that each state has. And that's how they form the Electoral College. He was elected unanimously. That means everyone voted for him. He's the only president to ever be voted into office unanimously. But it was also because he didn't have anyone running against him. So I guess that's how you end up with a unanimous vote. John Adams was voted as vice president. And there's a map of electoral votes in today's time. One of the other Revolutionary War generals had this quote when they were asked about how they felt about Washington, George Washington, and he said, he's first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. So he was a very honored, respected, and loved man. John Adams, this funny looking fellow, was our first vice president, and he will later become president as well. Okay, then his inauguration, which is just the ceremony where you swear in to become president. You swear your loyalty to the country. Often they put their hand on the Bible. And this one was actually held on the balcony of the Federal Hall in New York City. And Washington was the one who started the whole, I'm going to put my hand on the Bible when I take this oath into office. So that was a part of the inauguration that was kind of unplanned that Washington insisted he wanted to do and that they still do today. Washington's cabinet. Now, the word cabinet is kind of like your group of guys that are going to help you run things. So he chose his cabinet. Okay, so on his cabinet, these men are going to be his advisors. They're going to work right there with him. So his advisors here are going to be, of course, his two guys that we already mentioned, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. So he began dividing the executive branch into different departments and then choosing people to be the head of them. So he was delegating jobs within the executive branch. So the first he chose was going to be called the Department of State. And this was going to handle all foreign affairs, relationships with other countries. And then he chose Thomas Jefferson to be in charge of that. Remember, Thomas Jefferson, we said, was like meek and quiet, but extremely smart and well-spoken, and he wrote beautifully, remember? And so he is chosen to handle those relationships with other countries. And then the Department of Treasury is going to be headed up by Alexander Hamilton. So he's the Secretary of Treasury. This is all everything to do with our nation's money. So here's Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury. Now, these two men were great advisors for Washington, but they had a lot of difference of opinions. So, Alexander Hamilton believed in a very strong national government. He also believed that growth of cities and trade and factories and all that would be very important. Obviously, economics, right? Making money. And he wanted a national bank. Well, Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, he wanted more of a weak national government, not too much power to it. He wanted small farmers and skilled craftsmen and workers to be more important than powerful government. And he did not want a national bank. So with these two differences of opinions, we get our first political parties. Now, political parties in today's time, we think of Democrats, Republicans, liberals, independents, like all these different, mainly Democrat and Republican. But in this time, this split right here between these two men became known as the first two political parties. Alexander Hamilton's political party was known as the Federalists, and Jefferson's political party was known as the Democratic Republicans. So it was kind of one word now, and we split it into two today. And each of these groups each of these men ended up having a strong following. These political parties being born where people have similar views of what the government should be doing, and then they work to try to elect their side's point of view as members of the government offices. So if there's more people that agree with Thomas Jefferson in office, then more things like this are going to happen. So these people are going to be happy. But if they can elect more people that agree with Alexander Hamilton's point of views, then obviously these things are going to start happening. And then this side's going to be happy. So it's a constant back and forth. And we still deal with this really badly today. George Washington hated this. He hated the split parties. He said this will be something, these political parties will destroy our country. They're destructive. So if he could see us today, he'd really probably be shocked. So these political parties are born because these two men's differences in point of views. Now, after they formed this new government and they have elected the officials, they want a place to house and start to build these important buildings. And so they take a piece of land, and we know it today as Washington, D.C. But then it was just D.C., which is District of Columbia. It's not really its own state. It's just its own piece of land. Sometimes it's treated like a state when we think about elections and stuff, but it's its own piece. I've been there a couple times, but if you see on this map, everything's kind of laid out in a little square or diamond, if you would. Technically, it's partially in Virginia and partially in Maryland. See Maryland here, Virginia over here. This Potomac River, okay, that river is a big part of Washington, D.C. So at this point in time, they just called it District of Columbia, and it would be our nation's capital. Washington had a house. I actually went and visited his house one time, and they call it Mount Vernon. It was this beautiful plantation home right on the Potomac River and in Virginia. And so they built the nation's capital not far from there. After George Washington died in 1799, that's when they started calling it Washington, D.C. So technically our nation's capital is named after him. So it's a 10 square mile area. Now this fellow here, Pierre L'Enfant, he is a French artist and an engineer. He fought during the American Revolution, and he is going to be who they first get to help design the whole city of Washington, D.C., the buildings and the layout and everything. Benjamin Banneker, he is an inventor, a mathematician, an astronomer. He's the son of a freed slave, and he was asked by Washington to survey the land. Now, what's kind of cool about him is Pierre L'Enfant kind of abandoned the job midway through, and he took all of his paperwork with him that had all the plans drawn out. And so they thought they were going to have to like start from scratch again, and then it would delay the process. But Benjamin saved the day. He had it all saved to memory in his head and remembered everything and was able to draw it all back out perfectly with the plans so they didn't get behind. So he kind of saved the day with designing our nation's capital. Okay, now fast forward. And George Washington, said a while ago, he died in 1799, actually from a throat infection, kind of like strep throat today. And he was president until 1797. So after he was president, then of course our vice president, John Adams, became the second president. So him and his wife, Abigail Adams, are the first presidents to actually live in the White House. So the federal government moves into Washington, D.C., even though it's not completely finished, and John and Abigail Adams move into the White House. They joked and said the walls were still wet, which was actually true. It was first, they called it the President's House. They didn't call it the White House when they were first there. On one of our trips to Washington, D.C., I actually got to tour the White House all the way through the inside and see all of it. And so much of it hasn't even changed from back during this time period. It looks like you're walking through a history, it looks like you're walking into history because so much of it is just kept exactly like it was back then. Now, fast forward a little bit, and we have in 1801, Thomas Jefferson. Remember Thomas Jefferson? He is now president. So John Adams was president for one term, and then Thomas Jefferson becomes our next president. Now this is where I'm going to do a lot of fast forwarding, okay? So Thomas Jefferson's goal is to expand. And of course, he wants to expand west. So he spends his presidency expanding west. I'm going to exit out of this for a second to show you something. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, third president. We know a lot about him. He did not choose to live in the White House. He had his own home on Monticello, and that's a beautiful home. But he didn't live in the White House. He convinced Congress to lower taxes. He reduced the size of the government, because remember, he didn't want a strong government. He reduced the size of the armed forces. And he said, I'm not among those that fear the people. They, and not the rich, are our dependents for continued freedom. Now, he starts to get some explorers, even people you've probably heard of, like Daniel Boone, Sacagawea, Napoleon, Lewis and Clark. All these explorers help throughout this time and start to expand west. This is the picture I wanted you to see. Eventually, we have what's called the Louisiana Purchase. It doubles the size of the current United States. This one purchase that happens in 1803, we actually purchased it from Spain. This right here expands us really farther west, and it continues until eventually we have gone all the way west. You can see here. These are some of the trails or paths that some explorers took, and they would document everything they found, new plants, new animals, new waterways, the different kind of climate, and then they'd bring that information back to Thomas Jefferson so they could see what this land had to offer until there was no more land. So when they finally ran out of land and they knew a new ocean was here, they knew they had pretty much explored the entire country. So that was Thomas Jefferson's, one of his main goals. Okay, now after Thomas Jefferson's presidency, we get into, it's by 1809 at this point, and we get into James Madison as our president. And at this point, we end up in a war, mainly over the Atlantic Ocean's waterways and traveling. And guess who we're at war with? None other than Britain again. So by the War of 1812, we end up at war with Britain again. It's mostly naval battles out in the water. And during this War of 1812, we come out on top again, defeat Britain out in the water. And a poem was written by a man who was watching on a warship nearby. He was watching one of the battles, and he wrote this poem. He just pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket, and later this poem was put to music and is now our Star-Spangled Banner in today's time. Okay, now your assignment this week is going to be a little different. Your assignment this time, I'm going to let you have freedom totally to make it yourself. I'm not really going to give you a lot of direction on it. I want you to do it how you want to do it. But I want you to choose one of the first 20 presidents, okay? So any president from George Washington all the way to the 20th, okay? I want you to do a little research. Look up those names, maybe their pictures, and then I want you to choose one to do a little research on. And I want you to make me a slideshow. You can use PowerPoint, Google Slide, whatever you choose to use, any other slideshow technology. I want you to make me a little slideshow about the president you choose. I just taught you about George Washington, so think of it that way. Think about, when they became president, how they became president, some of their main goals, some of their accomplishments, where they lived, anything that was important during their presidency, their family, their accomplishments, maybe things if they had any negative things about them during their presidency, any famous quotes or something or anything like that, how they died or when their presidency ended, anything like that you can include. Pictures are fantastic. If you want to throw in a video link or anything like that, of course, the more creative, the better. But I challenge you to choose one president from the 1st through 20th and make me a little slideshow and then share it with me through Google. And again, you have total freedom with that. I'm not going to tell you a certain number of slides or whatever. Just give me some information. Show me you did a little research. And I'm excited to look at those. I've been having a lot of fun looking at your flip grids from the preamble. So some of you guys were pretty creative with some of those. So I look forward to seeing these. And I will see you guys next week. Y'all stay safe, stay healthy, be good. Bye.